Chapter 27. New London and Norwich. It seems that you take pleasure in these walks, sir. Massinger. New London is a city hiding within a river, 3 miles from its meeting with the waters of Long Island Sound. On the farthest seaward point of the western shore is a lighthouse. Before, and yet a little eastward of the river's mouth, is an island about 9 miles long screening it from the full power of Atlantic storms, and forming, with Watch Hill, the prolongation of the broken line of land stretching out into the Sound from the northern limb of the Long Island shore. Through this barrier, thrown across the entrance to the Sound, all vessels must pass. The island is Fisher's Island. It seems placed on purpose to turn into the Thames, all commerce winging its way eastward. Across the western extremity of Fisher's Island, on a fair night, New London and Montauk lights exchange burning glances. From Watch Hill, the low and distant shore of Long Island is easily distinguished by day, and by night its beacon light flashes in answer to its twin brother of Montauk. These two towers are the pillars of Hercules of the Sound, on which are hung the long and radiant gleams that bridge its gateway. Southwest of Fisher's Island are the two gull islets, on the smallest of which is a lighthouse. The swift tide which washes them is called the Horse Race. Next comes Plum Island, separated from the Long Island shore by a narrow and swift channel known as Plum Gut, through which cunning yachtsmen sometimes steer. In 1667, Samuel Willis of Hartford bought Plum Island for a barrel of biscuit and 100 awls and fishhooks. Anyone who looks at the long ellipse of water embraced within Long Island and the Connecticut shore, and remarks the narrow and obstructed channel through which it communicates with the Hudson, the chain of islands at its meeting with the ocean on the east, must be impressed with the belief that he is beholding one of the greatest physical changes that have occurred on the New England coast. As it is, Long Island Sound lacks little of being an inland sea. The absence of any certain indications of the channels of the rivers emptying into the Sound west of the Connecticut favors the theory of the union, at some former time, of Long Island at its western end with the mainland. To resume our survey of the coast, we see on the map, about midway between Point Judith and Montauk, the pear-shaped spot of land protruding above the ocean called Block Island. It is about 8 miles long, diversified with abrupt hills and narrow dales, but destitute of trees. A chain of ponds extending from the north and nearly to the center, with several separate and smaller ones, constitutes about 1/7 of the island. There is no ship harbor, and in bad weather fishing boats are obliged to be hauled on shore, though the sea mole in process of construction by government will afford both haven and safeguard against the surges of the Atlantic. For the island, having no rock foundation, is constantly wasting away. Cottages of wood, whitewashed every spring, are scattered promiscuously over the island, with wretched roads or lanes to accommodate every dwelling. The total disappearance of the island has often been predicted, and I recollect when the impression prevailed to some extent on the mainland that the islanders had only an eye apiece. Ascending now the river toward New London, wind, tide, or steam shall sweep us under the granite battlements of Fort Trumbull, on the one side, and the grassy mounds of Fort Griswold on the other. Near the latter is standing a monument commemorating the infamy of Benedict Arnold and the heroism of a handful of brave men sacrificed to what is called the chances of war. New London is seen straggling up the side of a steep and rocky hill dominated by 3 pointed steeples. Descending from the crest, its principal street opens like the mouth of a tunnel at the waterside into a broad space, always its marketplace and chief landing. Other avenues follow the natural shelf above the shore, or find their way deviously as streams might down the hillside. The glory of New London is in its trees, though in some streets they stand so thick as to exclude the sunlight and oppress the wayfarer with the feeling of walking in a churchyard. The destruction of New London by Arnold's command in 1781 has left little that is suggestive of its beginning. Its English settlement goes no farther back than 1646. In that year and the next a band of pioneers from the Massachusetts colony, among whom was John Winthrop, Jun, built their cottages and made these wilds echo with the sounds of their industry. Old London and Father Thames are repeated in New England, because, as these honest settlers avow, they loved the old names as much as they disliked the barbaric sounds of the aboriginal ones, though the latter were always typical of some salient characteristic. They settled upon the fair Mohegan, in the country of the Pequots, a race fierce and warlike, who in 1637 had made a death grapple of it with the pale faces and had been blotted out from among the red nations. Pequot was the name of the harbor, changed in 1658 to New London. I first visited New London in 1845. It was then a bustling place, a little too bustling, perhaps, when rival crews of whalemen in port joined battle in the marketplace, unpaving the street of its oyster shells and shouting war cries never before heard except at Otaheite or Juan Fernandez. A large fleet of vessels, engaged in whaling and sealing voyages, then sailed out of the Thames. The few old hulks laid up at the wharves, the rusty-looking oil butts and discarded paraphernalia pertaining to the fishery, yet reminded me of the hunters who lassoed the wild coursers of sea prairies. I have already confessed to a weakness for the wharves. There is one in New London, appropriated to the use of the lighthouse board, on which are piled hollow iron cylinders, spare anchors, chain cables, spars and spindles, buoys and beacons. A relief lightship and a tugboat with steam up lay beside it. The danger and privation of life in a lighthouse is not to be compared with that on board the lightship, which is towed to its station on some dangerous shoal or near some reef, and there anchored. It not unfrequently happens in violent storms that the lightship breaks from its moorings and meets the fate it was intended to signal to other craft. The sight of a raging sea as high as the decks of the vessel is one familiar to these hardy mariners. When I expressed surprise that men were willing to hazard their lives on these cockleshells, a veteran sea dog glanced at the scanty sail his vessel carried as he replied, "We can get somewhere." On the lightship, the lanterns are protected by little houses built around each mast until lighted when they are hoisted to the masthead. A fog bell is carried on the forecastle to be tolled in thick weather. A more funereal sound than its monotone, deep and heavy, vibrating across a sea shrouded in mist, can scarcely be imagined. Old sailors are considered to make the best keepers of either floating or stationary beacons. Their long habit of keeping watches on shipboard renders them more reliable than landsmen to turn out in all kinds of weather or on a sudden call. They are also far more observant of changes of the weather, of tides, or the position of passing vessels. I have found many persons in charge of our seacoast lights who had been ship masters and were men of more than ordinary intelligence. When the Fresnel lenticular light was being considered, it was objected by those having our system in charge that it would be difficult to procure keepers of sufficient intelligence to manage the lens apparatus. Fresnel replied that this difficulty had been most singularly exaggerated, as in France the country keepers belonged almost always to the class of ordinary mechanics or laborers, who, with 8 or 10 days' instruction, were able to perform their duties satisfactorily. All visitors to New London find their way, sooner or later, to the old Hempstead House, a venerable roof dotted with moss tufts, situated on J Street, not far west of the courthouse. It is one of the few antiques which time and the flames have spared. As one of the old garrison houses, standing in the midst of a populous city, it is an eloquent reminder of the race it has outlived. It was built and occupied by Sir Robert Hempstead, descending as entailed property to the 7th generation, who continued to inhabit it. The Hempstead House is near the cove around which the first settlement of the town appears to have clustered. The last remaining house built by the first settlers stood about half a mile west of the courthouse, on what was called Cape Ann Street. It was taken down about 1824. Governor Winthrop lived at the head of the cove, bearing his name at the north end of the city. The courthouse standing at the head of state, formerly Court Street, has the date of 1784 on the pediment, having been rebuilt after the burning of the town by Arnold. At the other end of the street was the jail. The courthouse, which formerly had an exterior gallery, has a certain family resemblance to the State House at Newport. It is built of wood, with some attempt at ornamentation. Freshened up with white paint and green blinds, it looked remarkably unlike a seat of justice, which is usually dirty enough in all its courts to be blind indeed. In the chancel of St. James's repose the ashes of Samuel Seabury, the first Anglican bishop in the United States. He took orders in 1753 in London, and on returning to his native country entered upon the work of his ministry. In 1775, having subscribed to a royalist protest, declaring his abhorrence of all unlawful congresses and committees, he was seized by the Whigs and confined in New Haven jail. Later in the war, he became chaplain of Colonel Fanning's regiment of American Loyalists. After the war, Mr. Seabury went to England in order to obtain consecration as bishop, but meeting with obstacles there, he was consecrated in Scotland by 3 non-juring bishops. The monument reproduced is from the old burying ground of New London. The ancient burial place of New London is in the northern part of the city, on elevated ground, not far from the river. An old fractured slab of red sandstone once bore the now illegible inscription. An epitaph on Captain Richard Lord, deceased May 17, 1662, Itatis Svi 51. Bright star of our chivalry lies here to the state a convensalor FVLL dear, and to ye TRVTH a friend of sweet content to Hartford town, a silver ornament who can deny to poor he was relafe, and in composing paroxys he was chafed to marchantes as a pattern, he might stand adventuring dangers new by sea and land. The harbor of New London being considered one of the best in New England, its claim to be a naval station has been urged from time to time upon the general government. It is spacious, safe, and deep. During the past winter, which has so severely tested the capabilities of our coast harbors, closing many of them with an ice blockade of long continuance, that of New London has remained open. In 1835, when the navigation of the harbor of New York was suspended, by being solidly frozen, New London harbor remained unobstructed, vessels entering and departing as in summer. Among other observations made among the shipping, I may mention the operations of the destructive worm that perforates a ship's bottom or a thick stick of timber with equal ease. I now had an opportunity of confirming what I had often been told, yet scarcely credited, that the worm could be distinctly heard while boring. The sound made by the borer exactly resembled that of an auger. It is not a little surprising to reflect that so insignificant a worm knot longer than a cambric needle, when it first attacks the wood is able to penetrate solid oak. I noticed evidences where these dreaded workmen were still busy, in little dust heaps lying on the timber, not yet removed from a vessel. With the aid of a wheezy ferry boat that landed me on Groton side, I still pursued my questionings or communings under the inspiration of a sunny afternoon, a transparent air, and a breeze brisk and bracing, bringing with it the full flavor of the sea. A climb up the steep ascent leading to the old fort was rewarded by the most captivating views, and by gales that are above blowing in the superheated streets of a city. The granite monument, which is our guide to the events these heights have witnessed, was built with the aid of a lottery. A marble tablet placed above its entrance is inscribed. This monument was erected under the patronage of the state of Connecticut, A.D. 1830, and in the 55th year of the independence of the USA in memory of the brave patriots who fell in the massacre of Fort Griswold near this spot. On the 6th of September, A.D. 1781, when the British, under the command of the traitor Benedict Arnold, burnt the towns of New London and Groton and spread desolation and woe throughout this region. Westminster Abbey could not blot out that arraignment. Dr. Johnson did not know Benedict Arnold when he said, "Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel." An American schoolboy, if asked to name the greatest villain the world has produced, would unhesitatingly reply, "The traitor, Benedict Arnold." The sentence which history has passed upon him is eternal. Some voice is always repeating it. Shortly after the peace of '83, Arnold was presented at court. While the king was conversing with him, Earl Balcarres, who had fought with Bergen in America, was announced. The king introduced them. "What, sire?" exclaimed the haughty old earl, refusing his hand. "The traitor Arnold." The consequence was a challenge from Arnold. The parties met, and it was arranged they should fire together. Arnold fired at the signal, but the earl, flinging down his pistol, turned on his heel and was walking away when his adversary called out, "Why don't you fire, my lord?" "Sir," said the earl, looking over his shoulder, "I leave you to the executioner." The British attack on New London was not a blind stroke of premeditated cruelty, but a part of the only real grand strategy developed since the campaign of Trenton. Sir Henry Clinton had been completely deceived by Washington's movement upon Yorktown and now launched his expedition upon Connecticut with the hope of arresting his greater adversary's progress. Arnold was the suitable instrument for such work. The expedition of 1781 landed on both sides of the harbor, one detachment under command of the traitor himself, near the lighthouse, the other at Groton Point. Fort Trumbull, being untenable, was evacuated, its little garrison crossing the river to Fort Griswold. Encountering nothing on his march except a desultory fire from scattered parties, Arnold entered New London and proceeded to burn the shipping and warehouses near the river. In his official dispatch, he disavows the general destruction of the town which ensued, but the testimony is conclusive that dwellings were fired and plundered in every direction by his troops, and under his eye. The force that landed upon Groton's side was led by Lieutenant Colonel Eyre against Fort Griswold, which then contained 150 men under Lieutenant Colonel William Ledyard, cousin of the celebrated traveler. The surrender of the fort being demanded and refused, the British assaulted it on 3 sides. They were resisted with determined courage, but at length effected an entrance into the work. Eyre had been wounded, and his successor, Montgomery, killed in the assault. Finding himself overpowered, Ledyard advanced and offered his sword to Major Bromfield, now in command of the enemy, who asked, "Who commands this fort?" "I did," courteously replied Ledyard, "but you do now." Bromfield immediately stabbed Ledyard with his own sword, and the hero fell dead at the feet of the coward and assassin. This revolting deed was reserved for a Tory officer, of whom Arnold officially writes Sir H. Clinton. His behavior on this occasion does him great honor. The survivors of the garrison were nearly all put to the sword, and even the wounded treated with incredible cruelty. Fort Griswold is a parallelogram, having a foundation of rough stone, on which very thick and solid embankments have been raised. It is the best preserved of any of the old earthworks I have seen since Fort George, at Castine. The position is naturally very strong, far stronger than Bunker Hill, which cost so many lives to carry. On all sides, except the east, the hill is precipitous. Here the ascent is gradual, and having surmounted it, an attacking force would find itself on an almost level area of sufficient extent to form 2,000 men. In consequence of the knowledge that this was their weak point of defense, the Americans constructed a small redoubt, the remains of which may still be seen about 300 yards distant from the main work. Groton was the seat of the Pequot power, the royal residence of Sassacus being situated on a commanding eminence called Fort Hill, 4 miles east of New London. This was his principal fortress, though there was another about 8 miles distant from New London, near Mystic, which was the scene of the memorable encounter which all our historians from Cotton Mather to Dr. Palfrey have related with such minuteness. The conquest of the Pequots, with whom, man against man, no other of the red nations near their frontiers dared to contend, was heroic in the little band of Englishmen by whom it was effected. The reduction to a handful of outcasts of a nation that counted 1,000 warriors was a stroke of fortune the English owed to the assistance of Uncas, a rebel against his lawful chieftain, Sassacus, and of Mayantanemo, whose alliance had been secured by Roger Williams. Captain John Mason, who had served under Fairfax in the Netherlands, is the ideal Puritan soldier. Before leading his men on to storm the Pequot stronghold, they knelt together in the moonlight, which shone brightly on that May morning, and commended themselves and their enterprise to God. Report says that the accompanying Narragansetts and Mohegans were much astounded and troubled at the sight. Satisfied that he could not conquer the Pequots hand to hand with his little force, Mason himself applied a firebrand to the wigwams. His own account of the Pequot War, reprinted by Prince in 1736, is the best and fullest narrative of its varying fortunes. Mason relates that he had but 1 pint of strong liquors in his army during its whole march. Like a prudent commander, he carried the bottle in his hand, and ingenuously says, when it was empty, the very smelling of it would presently recover such as had fainted away from the extremity of the heat. Among the special providences of the day, he mentions that Lieutenant Bull had an arrow shot into a hard piece of cheese he carried that probably saved his life, which may verify the old saying, adds the narrator, that a little armor would serve if a man knew where to place it. Fuller, in one of his sermons, has another and a similar proverb. It is better to fight naked than with bad armor, for the rags of a bad corslet make a deeper wound and worse to be healed than the bullet itself. Mason ultimately settled in Norwich and died there. Silas Deane was a native of Groton. Of the 3 men to whom Congress entrusted its secret negotiations with European powers, Franklin was the only one whose character did not permanently suffer, although he did not escape the malignity and envy of Arthur Lee. The Virginians' enmity and jealousy, aided by the influence of his brothers, were more successful in sullying the name and fame of Silas Deane. Yet Arthur Lee was a patriot and an honest man, whose public life was corroded by a morbid envy and distrust of his associates. A more disastrous appointment than his could hardly have been made, as his temperament especially unfitted him for a near approach to men who, with all the world's polish, were, in diplomatic phrase, able to cut an adversary's throat with a hair. John Quincy Adams, who may perhaps have inherited his father's dislike of Deane, once said, in the course of a conversation with some friends, "A son of Silas Deane was one of my schoolfellows. I never saw him again until last autumn, when I recognized him on board a steamboat and introduced him to Lafayette, who said, 'Do you and Deane agree?' I said, 'Yes.' 'That's more than your fathers did before you,' replied the general." Silas Deane, continued Mr. Adams, was a man of fine talents, but like General Arnold, he was not true to his country. After he was dismissed from the service of the United States, he went to England, lived for a long time on Lord Sheffield's patronage, and wrote a book which did more to widen the breach between England and America and produce unpleasant feelings between the two countries than any work that had been published. Finally, he determined to return to America, but in a fit of remorse and despair, committed suicide before the vessel left the Thames. His character and fate affected those of his son, who has lived in obscurity. It is possible that Silas Deane's patriotism was not proof against the ingratitude he had experienced, and that he became soured and disaffected, but it is scarcely just to his memory to call him traitor or compare him with such an ignoble character as Arnold. Deane was the friend of Beaumarchais. He was also his confidant. He was the means of securing the services of Lafayette for America. There is little doubt that he exceeded his powers as commissioner, involving Congress in embarrassments, of which his recall was the solution. The malevolence of Lee and the crookedness of French diplomacy did what was wanting to consign him to obscurity and poverty. The controversy over Deane's case produced a pamphlet from Thomas Paine and caused John Jay to take the place resigned by Mr. Laurens as President of Congress. Deane and Beaumarchais were the scapegoats of the French alliance. John Ledyard was another monument of Grattan. His first essay as a traveler exhibits his courage and resource. He entered Dartmouth as a divinity student, but poverty obliging him to withdraw from the college, and not having a shilling in his pocket, he made a canoe 50 feet long, with which he floated down the river 140 miles to Hartford. He then embarked for England as a common sailor, and while there, under the impulse of his passion for travel, enlisted with Captain Cook as a corporal of Marines. He witnessed the tragical death of his captain. In 1771, after 8 years' absence, Ledyard revisited his native country. His mother was then keeping a boarding house at Southold. Her son took lodgings with her without being recognized, as had once happened to Franklin in similar circumstances. Ledyard's subsequent exploits in Europe, Asia, and Africa bear the impress of a daring and adventurous spirit. At last, he offered himself for the more perilous enterprise of penetrating into the unknown regions of Central Africa. A letter from Sir Joseph Banks introduced him to the projectors of the expedition. "Before I had learned," says the gentleman to whom Sir Joseph's letter was addressed, "the name and business of my visitor, I was struck with the manliness of his person, the breadth of his chest, the openness of his countenance, and the inquietude of his eye." Spreading the map of Africa before him, and tracing a line from Cairo to Sennar, and thence westward in the latitude and supposed direction of the Niger, I told him that was the route by which I was anxious that Africa might, if possible, be explored. He said he should consider himself singularly fortunate to be entrusted with the adventure. I asked him when he would set out. His answer was, "Tomorrow morning." New London's annals afford a passing glimpse of two men who, though enemies, were worthy of each other. During the war with England of 1812, Decatur, with the United States, Macedonian, and Hornet, was blockaded in New London by Sir T.M. Hardy with a squadron of superior force. The presence of the British fleet was a constant menace to the inhabitants, disquieted as they also were by the recollections of Arnold's descent. In vain Decatur tried to escape the iron grip of his adversary. Hardy's vigilance never relaxed, and the American vessels remained as uselessly idle to the end of the war, as if laid up in ordinary. Once Decatur had prepared to slip away unperceived to sea, but signals made to the hostile fleet from the shore compelled him to abandon the attempt. He then proposed to Hardy a duel between his own and an equal force of British ships, which, though he did not absolutely decline the challenge, it is pretty evident Sir Thomas never meant should happen. Decatur was brave, fearless, and chivalric. He was the handsomest officer in the Navy. Coleridge, who knew him well at Malta, always spoke of him in the highest terms. Our history does not afford a more impressive example of a useful life uselessly thrown away. Of his duel with Baron, the following is probably a correct account of the closing scene. The combatants approached within 16 feet of each other, because one was nearsighted, and the rule was that both should take deliberate aim before the word was given. They both fired, and fell with their heads not 10 feet apart. Each believed himself mortally hurt. Before their removal from the ground, they were reconciled, and blessed each other, declaring there was nothing between them. All that was necessary to have prevented the meeting was a personal explanation. Sir T. Hardy is well known as the captain of Nelson's famous flagship, the Victory, and as having received these last utterances of the dying hero, "Anchor, Hardy, anchor." When the captain replied, "I suppose my Lord Admiral Collingwood will now take upon himself the direction of affairs." "Not while I live, I hope, Hardy," cried the dying chief, endeavoring ineffectually to raise himself from the bed. "No," he added, "do you anchor, Hardy? Shall we make the signal, sir?" "Yes," replied his lordship, "for if I live, I'll anchor. Take care of my dear Lady Hamilton, Hardy, take care of poor Lady Hamilton. Kiss me, Hardy." With whatever local preferences the traveler may have come, he will think the approach to Norwich charming. Through banks high and green, crested with groves, or decked with white villages, the river slips quietly away to mingle in the noisy world of waters beyond. In deeper shadows of the hills, the pictures along the banks are reproduced with marvelous fidelity of form and coloring, and even the blue of the sky and white drifting clouds are mirrored there. All terrestrial things, however, appear, as in the camera, inverted roofs or steeples pointing downward, men or animals walking with feet upward, along the banks, like flies on a ceiling. When autumn tints are on, the effects seen in the water are heightened by the confused masses of sumptuous foliage hung like garlands along the shores. Norwich is ranged about a hill overlooking the Thames. It is on a point of rockland enfolded by two streams, the Yantic and Sheducket, that come tumbling and hurrying down from the higher northern ranges to meet and kiss each other in the Thames. Rising, terrace above terrace, the appearance of Norwich, as viewed from the river, is more striking in its ensemble than by reason of particular features. The waterside is the familiar dull red, above which glancing roofs and steeples among trees are seen retreating up the ascent. By night, a ridged and chimneyed blackness bestrewed with lights rewards the curious gazer from the deck of a sound steamboat. I admired in Norwich the broad avenues, the wealth of old trees, the luxurious spaciousness of the private grounds. Washington Street is one of the finest I have walked in. There is breathing room everywhere, town and country seeming to meet and clasp hands, each giving to the other of the best it had to offer. I do not mean that Norwich is countrified, but its mid-city is so easily escaped as to do away with the feeling of imprisonment in a wilderness of brick, stone, and plate glass. The suburban homes of Norwich have an air of substantial comfort and delicious seclusion. In brief, wherever one has made up his mind to be buried, he would like to live in Norwich. There are not a few picturesque objects about Norwich, especially by the shores of the Yantic, which, since being robbed of the falls, once its pride and glory, has become a prosaic millstream. The water is of the blackness of Acheron, streaked with amber where it falls over rocks, and of a rusty brown in shallows, as if partaking of the color of bits of decayed wood or dead leaves which one sees at the bottom. The stream, after having been vexed by dams and tossed about by mill wheels, bounds joyously, and with some touch of savage freedom, to strike hands with the Sheducket. The practical reader should be told that the city of Norwich is the outgrowth, and was of yore the landing of Norwich Town, 2 miles above it. The city was then known as Chelsea and Norwich Landing. The Mohegans were lawful owners of the soil. Subsequent to the Pequot War, hostilities broke out between Uncas, chief of the Mohegans, and Myantonimo, the Narragansett sachem. The Narragansetts invaded the territory of the Mohegans, and a battle occurred on the Great Plains, near Greenville, a mile and a half below Norwich. The Narragansetts suffered defeat, and their chief became a prisoner. He was delivered by Uncas to the English, who condemned him to death and devolved upon Uncas the execution of the sentence. The captive chief was led to the spot where he had been made prisoner, and, while stalking with Indian stoicism in the midst of his enemies, was killed by one blow from a tomahawk at the signal of Uncas. Mayantanimo was buried where he fell, and from him the spot takes its name of Sachem's Plain. War continued between the Narragansetts and Mohegans, the former, led by a brother of Mayantanimo, being again the assailants. Uncas was at length compelled to throw himself within his strong fortress, where he was closely besieged and in danger of being overpowered. He found means to send intelligence to Saybrook, where Captain Mason commanded that his supply of food was exhausted. Mason immediately sent Thomas Leffingwell with a boatload of provision, which enabled Uncas to hold out until his enemy withdrew. For this act, which he performed single-handed, Leffingwell received from Uncas the greater part of Norwich. And in 1659, by a formal deed, signed by Uncas and his two sons, Owainco and Atawanhood, he, with Mason, Reverend James Fitch, and others, became proprietors of the whole of Norwich. I did not omit a visit to the ground where the buried majesty of Mohegan is lying. It is on the bank of the Yantic, in a secluded though populous neighborhood. A granite obelisk, with the name of Uncas in relief at its base, erected by citizens of Norwich, stands within the enclosure. The foundation was laid by President Jackson in 1833. Around are clustered a few mossy stones chiseled by English hands, with the brief record of the hereditary chieftains of a once powerful race. In its native state, the spot must have been singularly romantic and well chosen. A wooded height overhangs the river in full view of the falls, where their turbulence subsides into a placid onward flow, and where the chiefs, ere their departure for the happy hunting grounds, might look their last on the villages of their people. It was the Indian custom to bury by the margin of river, lake, or ocean. Here, doubtless, repose the bones of many grim warriors, seated in royal state, with their weapons and a pot of succotash beside them. The last interment here was of Ezekiel Mazon, a descendant of Uncas, in 1826. The feeble remnant of the Mohegans followed him to the grave. Mr. Sparks remarks that the history of the Indians, like that of the Carthaginians, has been written by their enemies. As the faithful, unwavering ally of the English, Uncas has received the encomiums of their historians. His statesmanship has been justified by time and history. By alliance with the English, he preserved his people for many generations after the more numerous and powerful Pequots, Narragansetts, and Wampanoags had ceased to exist. In 1638, he came with his present of wampum to Boston, and having convinced the English of his loyalty, thus addressed them. "This heart," laying his hand upon his breast, "is not mine, but yours. Command me any difficult service, and I will do it. I have no men, but they are all yours. I will never believe any Indian against the English any more." It is this invincible fidelity, approved by important services, that should make his name and character respected by every descendant of the fathers of New England. About midway of the pleasant avenue that unites Old Norwich with New is the birthplace of Benedict Arnold. Somewhat farther on, and when within half a mile of the town, you also see at the right the homely little building which was the apothecary's, in which Arnold worked as a boy with pestle and mortar to the acceptance of his master, Dr. Lathrop, who lived in the adjoining mansion. One can better imagine Arnold dealing out musket bullets than pills, and mixing brimstone with saltpeter rather than harmless drugs. As a boy, he was bold, high-spirited, and cruel. In this neighborhood, I saw a group of elms unmatched for beauty in New England. One of them is a king among trees. They are on a grassy slope, before an inviting mansion, and are in the full glory of maturity. It was a feast to stand under their branching arms and be fanned and soothed by the play of the breeze among their green tresses that fell in fountains of rustling foliage from their crowned heads. A benison on those old trees. May they never fall into the clutches of that class who have a real and active hatred of everything beautiful, or that appeals to more than their habitual perception is able to discover. I made a brief visit at the mansion built by General Jedediah Huntington before he removed to New London after the Old War. In the dining room was a full length of General Eben Huntington, painted by Trumbull at the age of 18. On seeing it some years afterward, Trumbull took out his penknife and said to his host and friend, Ebb, let me put my knife through this. Another portrait by the same hand, representing the general at the Siege of Yorktown, is in a far different manner. The three daughters of General Huntington, then living in the old family mansion, in referring to the warm friendship between their father and the painter, mentioned that the first and last portraits painted by Colonel Trumbull were of members of their family. Near General Huntington's, where many of the choicest spirits of the Revolution have been entertained, is the handsome mansion of Governor Huntington, a remote connection of his military neighbor. Without the advantages of a liberal education, he became a member of the Old Congress, and its president, chief justice, and governor of Connecticut. President Dwight, who knew him well, extols his character and abilities warmly and highly. I had frequent opportunities of seeing, in my rambles about the environs of New London and Norwich, the beautiful dwarf flowering laurel Kalmia augustifolia that is almost unknown farther north. In the woods, where it was growing in wild luxuriance, it appeared like a gigantic azalea, ablaze with fragrant bloom of white and pink. It used to be said that honey collected by the bee from this flower was poisonous. The broad-leaved laurel, or calico tree, Kalmia latifolia, was believed to be even more injurious, instances being mentioned where death had occurred from eating the flesh of pheasants that had fed on its leaves. Norwich town represents the kernel from which the city has sprung, and retains also no little of the savor incident to a population that has held innovations at arm's length. It has quiet, freshness, and a certain rural comeliness. A broad green, or common, planted with trees, is skirted by houses, many of them a century or more old, among which I thought I now and then detected the no longer familiar well sweep, with the old oaken bucket standing by the curb. On one side of the common, the old courthouse is still seen. Take the path beside the meeting house, ascending the overhanging rocks by some natural steps, and you will be richly repaid for the trifling exertion. The view embraces a charming little valley watered by the Yantic, which here flows through rich meadowlands and productive farms. Encompassing the settlement is another elevated range of the rocky hills common to this region, making a sort of amphitheater in which the town is naturally placed. The old church of Norwich town formerly stood in the hollow between two high hills above its present site. The Pound, now its next neighbor, is still a lawful enclosure in most of the New England states. Not many years ago, I knew of a town in Massachusetts that was presented by a grand jury for not having one. I visited the old graveyard, remarkable for its near return to a state of nature. Many stones had fallen, and sometimes two were kept upright by leaning one against the other. Weeds, brambles, and vines impeded my footsteps or concealed the gravestones. I must often repeat the story of the shameful neglect which involves most of our older cemeteries. One is not quite sure, in leaving them, that he does not carry away on his feet the dust of former generations. Some of the stones are the most curious in form and design I have met with. The family tombs of Governor and General Huntington are here. Footnotes: Watch Hill, in the town of Westerly and near Stonington, is the southwestern extremity of Rhode Island. Named from Captain Adrian Block, a Dutch navigator. Its Indian name was Manassas. There are about 1,200 inhabitants on this island, all native-born, of whom 275 are voters. There are also 6 schools, 2 Baptist churches, and 2 windmills, a hotel, and several summer boarding houses. 200 fishing boats are owned by the islanders. In 1636, John Oldham, mentioned in our ramble in Plymouth, was murdered here by the Pequots. Block Island in 1672 was made a township, by the name of New Shoreham. The 2 forts, Trumbull and Griswold, are named from governors of Connecticut. They date from the Revolution. Fort Trumbull in its present form was completed in 1849, under the supervision of General G.W. Cullom, USA, in passing through New London in April 1776. General Knox, by Washington's direction, examined the harbor with the view of erecting fortifications, and reported, by letter, that it would, in connection with Newport, afford a safe retreat to the American Navy or its prizes in any wind that blew. Son of Governor Winthrop, of Massachusetts, he passed his first winter on Fisher's Island, which remained in his family through 6 generations. The valuable manuscript collection, known as the Winthrop Papers, was found some years ago on the island, which belongs to New York in consequence of the grants to the Earl of Stirling and the Duke of York. The origin of its present name is uncertain, though so called as early as 1636. Governor Winthrop relates to Cotton Mather a singular incident which happened on Fisher's Island the previous winter. During the severe snowstorms, hundreds of sheep, besides cattle and horses, were buried in the snow. Even the wild beasts came into the settlements for shelter. 28 days after the storm alluded to, the tenants of Fisher's Island, in extricating the bodies of 100 sheep from one bank of snow in the valley, found 2 alive in the drift, where they had subsisted by eating the fleeces of those lying dead near them. In 1834, New London employed 36 vessels in whaling and sealing. A few are still engaged in the latter fishery, in the extreme navigable waters of the Arctic and Antarctic seas. During the unexampled cold of the past winter, 1874-75, the light boat off New London was, in fact, carried away from her moorings by an ice field, and many others all along the coast were stranded. At the lighthouses I have visited in cold weather, the unvarying complaint is made of the poor quality of the oil furnished by the lighthouse board. One keeper told me he was obliged to shovel the congealed lard oil out of the tank in the oil room and carry it into the dwelling, some rods distant, to heat it on his stove, sometimes repeating the operation frequently during the night in order to keep his light burning. It is shown in the view of New London in 1813, at the head of this chapter. Bishop Seabury was born in 1728 and died in 1796, aged 68. In person, he was large, robust, and vigorous, dignified and commanding in appearance, and loved by his parishioners of low estate. After consecration, he discharged the functions of bishop of the Diocese of Connecticut and Rhode Island. The months of January and February, 1875, will be long remembered in New England for the intense and long-continued cold weather. Long Island Sound was a vast ice field, which sealed up its harbors. For a time navigation was entirely suspended, the boats usually plying between Newport, Stonington, New London, and New York being obliged to discontinue their voyages. Gardiner's Bay was completely closed. The shore of Long Island, on its ocean side, was strewed with great blocks of ice. An unusual number of disasters signalized the ice embargo throughout the whole extent of the New England coast. In all, the British destroyed 143 buildings, 65 of which were dwellings, and including the courthouse, jail, and church. In the Wadsworth Museum, Hartford, the vest and shirt worn by Ledyard on the day of his death are still shown to the visitor. Lafayette, when attacking the British redoubt at Yorktown, ordered his men, it is said with Washington's consent, to remember New London. The Continental soldiers could not or would not execute the command on prisoners who begged their lives on their knees. Soon after the surrender, a wagon loaded with wounded Americans was set in motion down the hill. In its descent, it struck with great force against a tree, causing the instant death of several of its occupants. Gordon's Revolution, Volume Roman IV, p. 179. Captain Mason, with the Connecticut and Massachusetts forces, numbering in all only 90 men, together with about 400 Narragansetts and Mohegans, attacked the Pequot fortress on the morning of May 26, 1637. His Indian allies skulked in the rear. Mason's onset was a complete surprise, but he would not have succeeded had he not fired the fort, which created a panic among the enemy and rendered them an easy prey to the English and friendly Indians surrounding it. Between 600 and 700 Pequots perished. The English in these early wars fought in armor, that is to say, a steel cap and corselet with a back and breast piece over buff coats, the common equipment everywhere of that day for a horse or foot soldier. Mr. John Quincy Adams accompanied his father to France and was placed at school near Paris. Miss E. S. Quincy's Memoir. In 1835, when President Jackson demanded 25 millions of francs on account of French spoliations, the claim of Beaumarchais was allowed, after deducting 1,000,000 livres which had been advanced by Vergennes. Dean's heirs did not obtain an adjustment of his claims by Congress until 1842. Ledyard proceeded no farther than Cairo, where he died, in 1788, of a bilious fever. Decatur offered to match the United States and Macedonian with the Endymion and Statira. Sir Thomas declined the proposal as made, but consented to a meeting between the Statira and Macedonian alone. Nelson commended almost with his latest breath Lady Hamilton and his daughter as a legacy to his country. Lady Hamilton, however, died in exile, sickness, and actual want at Calais, France, in 1815. The falls were very beautiful and have been celebrated by Trumbull's pencil and Mrs. Sigourney's verse. There still remain some curious cavities, worn in the rock by the prolonged rotary motion of loose stones. Lydia Huntley Sigourney, the most celebrated writer in prose or poetry of her day in New England, was a native of Norwich. Before the battle with the Narragansetts, Uncas is said to have challenged Mayantanimo to single combat, promising for himself and his nation to abide the result. Mayantanimo refused. This chief, in his flight from the field, was overtaken by Mohegan warriors, who impeded him until Uncas could come up. When Uncas laid his hand on Mayantanimo's shoulder, the latter sat down in token of submission, maintaining a sullen silence. Uncas is said to have eaten a piece of his flesh. The proprietors numbered 35. Uncas received about £70 for 9 square miles. The settlement of Norwich is considered to have begun in 1660, when Reverend James Fitch removed from Saybrook to Norwich town. The following inscriptions are from the royal burial ground of the Mohegans. Here lies ye body of Pompey Uncas, son of Benjamin and Anne Uncas, and of ye royal blood, who died May ye 1st, 1740, in ye 21st year of his age. Here lies Sam Uncas, the 2D and beloved son of his father, John Uncas, who was the grandson of Uncas, Grand Sachem of Mohegan, the darling of his mother, being daughter of said Uncas, Grand Sachem. He died July 31st, 1741, in the 28th year of his age. In memory of Elizabeth Joquib, the daughter of Mahomet, great-grandchild to ye first Uncas, Great Sachem of Mohegan, who died July ye 5th, 1750, aged 33 years. The hereditary chieftainship was extinct as long ago as the beginning of the century. The Mohegans occupied a strip of land containing 2,700 acres, lying on the Thames between Norwich and New London, above the mouth of Stony Brook, and between the river and Montville. In 1633, the Indian population of Connecticut was computed at 8 persons to the square mile. The earliest enumeration of the Mohegans made their number 1,663 souls. In 1797, only 400 remained. By 1825, the nation was reduced to a score or two, a portion having emigrated to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The Mohegan Reserve was divided in 1,790 among the remaining families of the nation. The Mohegans were probably a distinct nation, though Uncas was a vassal of the Pequots. On the Colchester Road, or Town Street, near the junction of a street leading toward the falls, the estate is now locally known as the Ripley Place. The general was appointed collector of New London by Washington. His first wife was a daughter of Governor Trumbull. Chapter 28. Saybrook. Says Tweed to Till, what gars ye rinna say ye still? Says Till to Tweed, though ye rin why speed, and I rin slaw, for I man that ye droon, I droon twa. Old Song. Rather more than 100 miles from New York, the railway crosses the Connecticut River, on one of those bridges that at a little distance resemble spiders' webs hung between the shores. From here one may look down quite to the river's mouth, where it enters the Sound, and if it be a warm summer's day, the bluish-gray streak of land across it may be seen. The Connecticut is the only river of importance emptying upon the New England coast that has not an island lodged in its throat. It was on one of those parched days of midsummer, when the very air is quivering, and every green thing droops and shrivels under a vertical sun, that I first alighted at the station at Saybrook. The listless, fagged, and jaded air of city swells lounging about the platform, the flushed faces of blooming girls and watchful dowagers, betoken the general prostration of weary humanity, who yearned for the musical plash of sea waves as the withering leaves and dusty grass longed for rain. How feminine New England exaggerates, to be sure. A group of 3 young ladies exchange their views upon the sultriness of the day. One observes, "What a dreadful hot day." A second declares it horrid, torrid, perhaps she meant to say, and the last pronounces it perfectly frightful, emphasizing the opinion by opening her umbrella with a sharp snap. What they would have said to an earthquake, a conflagration, or a shipwreck is left to bewildering conjecture. In a certain unquiet portion of the American Union, the term Connecticut Yankee is expressive of concentrated dislike for shrewd bargaining, a nasal twang of speech, and a supposed desire to overreach one's neighbor. How often have I heard in the South the expression, "a mean Yankee," as if forsooth meanness were sectional. Here in New England, a Connecticut Yankee is spoken of as a cunning blade or sharp fellow, as an Englishman would say, "He's Yorkshire," or an Italian, "I grave spoltino." The day of wooden nutmegs is past and gone, and Connecticut is more familiarly known as the land of steady habits. The whole state is a hive. Every smoky town you see is a busy workshop. The problem of the Connecticut man is how to do the most work in the shortest time, whether by means of a sewing machine, a colt, or a mitrailleuse. If I should object to anything in him, it would be the hurry and worry, the drive, which impels him through life, and in this I do not imagine he differs from the average American man of business until, like one of his own engines that is always worked under a full pressure of steam, he stops running at last. That is why we see so many old men of 30 and so many premature gray hairs in New England. But what I chiefly lament is the disappearance of the Yankee, not the conventional Yankee of the theater, for he had never an existence elsewhere, but the hearty yet suspicions, cute though green, drawling, whittling, unadulterated Yankee, with his broad humor, delicious patois, and large-hearted patriotism. His very mother tongue is forgotten. Not once during these rambles have I heard his old familiar "I swayo," or "git ayut," or "do tell." Railway and telegraph, factory and workshop, penetrating into the most secluded hamlets, have rubbed off all the crust of an originality so pronounced as to have become the type, and often the caricature, too, of American nationality the world over. One peculiarity I have noticed is that of calling spinsters, of whatever age, girls. I knew 2 elderly maiden ladies, each verging on 60, who were universally spoken of as the young girls, their names, I should perhaps explain, being young. Once, when in quest of lodgings in a strange place, I was directed to apply to the 2 brown girls, whose united ages, as I should judge, could not be less than a century and a quarter. But one is not to judge of New England girls by this sample. Another practice which prevails in some villages is that of designating father and son, where both have a common Christian name, as Big Tom and Little Tom, and brother and sister as Bub and Sis. One can hardly maintain a serious countenance to hear a stalwart fellow of 6 feet alluded to as Little Tom, or Joe, or Bill, or a full-grown man or woman as Bub or Sis. On the coast, nicknames are current principally among the seafaring element. Guinea Bill, or Portugee Jack, presupposes the owner to have made a voyage to either of those distant lands. The Italians count the whole 24 hours, beginning at half an hour after sunset. By this method of computation, I reckoned on arriving at Saybrook Point at exactly 22 o'clock. I walked through the village leisurely observant of its outward aspect, which was that of undisturbed tranquility. Modern life had been so long in reaching it that it had been willing to accommodate itself to the old houses and so far to the old life of the place. The toilets here, as elsewhere, encroached in many instances upon those of the last century and were wonderfully like the portraits one sees of the time. Now, let us have the old manners back again. One of the pleasantest old houses in Saybrook is the Hart Mansion, which stands in the main street of the village, heavily draped by the foliage of 3 elm trees of great size and beauty. It was a favorite retreat of that gallant sailor, Isaac Hull, who lost his heart there. Like Nelson, he was the idol of his sailors, for he was as humane as he was brave. He seldom ordered one of his old sea dogs to be flogged, but would call a culprit before him, and after scolding him soundly with affected roughness of tone and manner, would tell him to return to his duty. The old Ironsides was loved with a love almost like that which man bears to woman. Ladies would have kissed the hem of her sails, men scraped the barnacles from her bottom, and carried them home in their pockets. I have seen no end of canes, picture frames, and other souvenirs of this famous ship treasured by fortunate possessors, and one of the old merchants of Boston had his street door made of her oak. Saybrook is languid. It is dispersed along one broad and handsome street, completely canopied by an arch of foliage. You seem, when at the entrance, to be looking through a green tunnel. In this street, there is no noise and but little movement. The few shops were without custom, after the spasm of activity caused by the arrival of the train when it seemed for the moment to rub its eyes and brisk up a little, carriages and pedestrians having mysteriously disappeared somewhere the old town dozed again. The Connecticut is here tame and uninteresting, with near shores of salt marsh flatness. Yellow sandbars, green hummocks, or jutting points skirted with pine groves enclose the stream, which is broad, placid, and shallow. There are no iron headlands or dangerous reefs. Nature seems quite in harmony with the general quietude and restfulness. A few years ago, there existed at the point the remains of a colonial fortress, with much history clustering around it. It was raised in the very infancy of English settlement at the mouth of the Connecticut, and when the Revolution came, the old dismounted cannon, that had perhaps done duty with Howard or Blake, were again placed on the ramparts. The railway people have reduced the hill on which it stood to a flat and dreary gravel waste. This is walking into antiquity with a vengeance. It is perhaps fortunate that the Colosseum, Temple Bar, and St. Denis are not where they would be valued for the cubic yards of waste material they might afford. The Dutch anticipated the English in the settlement on Connecticut River. The Hollanders at Fort Amsterdam and the then rival colonies of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were each desirous of obtaining a foothold which each felt too weak to undertake alone. The country had been subjugated by the Pequots, whose territory neither colony might invade without bringing the whole nation upon them. The Dutch were also first to visit the river and to inform the pilgrims of its beauty and advantages for traffic. In 1633, Massachusetts having rejected overtures for a joint occupation, Plymouth determined to establish a trading post upon the river without her aid. Apprised of this intention, the Dutch dispatched an expedition, which disembarked where Hartford now is. A house was hastily erected, and ordnance mounted, with which the Hollanders gave notice that they meant to keep out intruders. The Plymouth expedition, under command of William Holmes, ascended the river, and notwithstanding an attempt to stop them, passed by the Dutch fort. They landed at Nattawanout, afterward Windsor, and having made themselves secure, sent their vessel home. Word was sent to Fort Amsterdam of the invasion. A company of 70 dispatched to the scene advanced, brimful of wrath and cabbage, with drums beating and colors flying, against the English fort. Seeing the pilgrims were in nowise disconcerted, the Dutch captain ordered a halt. A parley took place, and having thus vindicated the national honor, Gualtier Twilly's men withdrew. The attempts of Plymouth to establish tributary plantations, with trading posts, at the extreme eastern and western limits of New England were equally disastrous. Massachusetts stood quietly by and saw her rival dispossessed at Penobscot, but at Windsor the Plymouth people soon found themselves hemmed in between settlements made by emigrants from the bay. As a quarrel would perhaps have been alike fatal to both, Plymouth gave way to her more powerful neighbor. The English settlement of Connecticut is usually assigned to the year 1635, the year of beginnings at Hartford, Wethersfield, and Saybrook. In the autumn, the younger Winthrop sent a few men to take possession and fortify at the mouth of the Connecticut, as agent of Lords Say, Brooke, and their associate owners of the patent. This expedition forestalled by a few days only a new attempt to obtain possession by the Dutch, who, finding the English already landed and having cannon mounted, abandoned their design. Through the agency of the celebrated Hugh Peters, the patentees engaged and sent to New England Lyon Gardiner, a military engineer who had served in the Low Countries. He arrived at Boston in November, 1635, and proceeded to the fort at the mouth of the Connecticut. He was followed by George Fenwick, sent over by Lord Say to be resident agent of the English proprietors. Fenwick, accompanied by Peters, reached the fort in the spring. The plantation was called Saybrook, as a compliment to the two principal personages interested in its founding. Saybrook has perhaps acquired a certain importance in the eyes of historical writers to which no other spot of New England's soil can pretend. There is little room to doubt that Lord Say, and perhaps some of his associates, strongly entertained the idea of removing thither. A more debatable assertion, which is, however, well fortified with authorities, represents Oliver Cromwell, John Hampden, Pym, and Sir Arthur Haslerigg as having been prevented from embarking only by an express order from the king. Some, indeed, assert that they actually embarked. In the old burial place of Saybrook Point is the most curious sepulchral memorial in New England. I can compare it with nothing but a Druid monument. It is so massy, so roughly shaped, and so peculiar in form. Until a few years ago, it stood within a field southwest of the fort, over the dust of George Fenwick's wife, a woman of gentle blood. The improvements made by the railway in this vicinity caused the removal of the monument to its present position. When the remains of Lady Fenwick were disinterred, the skeleton was found to be nearly entire. Beneath the skull was lying a heavy braid of auburn hair, which was parceled out among the villagers. My informant offered to show me the tress that had fallen to his share. I acknowledge it, I am the fool of association, and when I see the spade thrust among graves, I wince a little. I would have Shakespeare's appeal and malediction inscribed over the entrance to every old graveyard in New England. But after all, what is Shakespeare's malediction to these trouble tombs who anticipate the resurrection and give the burial service the lie? Our bones ache at the thought of being tossed about on a laborer's shovel. Rather come cremation than mere tenure at will at the tender mercies of these levelers. When we have been put to bed with a shovel, and have pulled our green coverlet over us, let us have the peace that passeth all understanding. Not much is known of Lady Anne Boteler, or Butler, the wife of George Fenwick. It is surmised that she died in childbed. The inscription that her monument undoubtedly bore has been so long obliterated that no record remains of it. A newer one, with the simple name and date, Lady Fenwick, died 1648, has been cut in the perishable sandstone. Someone has also caused the cross to be chiseled there. Considering the peculiar aversion with which the Puritans regarded the cross, the appearance of one on the tombstone of Lady Fenwick is suggestive of the famous prohibition of the cemetery of St. Maynard. De par le roi, défense et de faire miracle en silu. Dr. Dwight states, as of report, that Fenwick, before his return to England, made provision for having his wife's tomb kept in repair. The sale of the title of Lord Say and Brooke by him, in 1644, to Connecticut, is considered evidence as well of the existence of the design of removal alluded to as of its abandonment. After the death of Lady Fenwick, her husband returned to England, and is mentioned as one of the regicide judges. He subsequently appears with the title of Colonel, and is believed to be the same person who besieged Hume Castle in 1650 for Cromwell. On being summoned, the governor sent his defiance in verse. I, William of the Wassel, am now in my castle, and all the dogs in the town shanna gar me gang down. The English at Saybrook Point protected the land approach with a palisade drawn across the narrow isthmus, which very high tides overflowed and isolated from the mainland. Their cornfield was 2 miles distant from the fort, and skulking Pequots were always on the alert to waylay and murder them. Some of the bay magistrates having spoken contemptuously of Indian arrows, Gardiner sent them the rib of a man in which one, after passing through the body, had buried itself so that it could not be withdrawn. Gardiner's manner of dealing with Indians was peculiar. When the expedition against the Pequots was at Saybrook Fort, distrusting Mohegan faith, he resolved to make a trial of it. He therefore called Uncas before him and said, You say you will help Major Mason, but I will first see it. Therefore send you now 20 men to the Bass River, for there went yesternight 6 Indians in a canoe thither. Fetch them now, dead or alive, and then you shall go with Major Mason, else not. So Uncas sent his men, who killed 4 and captured 1, the 6th making his escape. The old burial ground of Saybrook is neat and well kept. Lady Fenwick's monument is just within the entrance, concealed by a clump of fir trees. Not a quarter of the graves have stones, and that part of the ground occupied by the ancients of the village is so mounded and overcrowded that you may not avoid walking upon them. In another spot, headstones jutted above the turf at every variety of angle, and several monuments had cavities, showing where they had been robbed of leaden coats of arms to run into bullets, perhaps. All are of ample dimensions, and on older ones creeping mosses conceal the inscriptions. The variety of color presented by slate, sandstone, or marble upon green is not unpleasing to the eye, yet those reckonings scored upon slate shall endure longest. In the Hart enclosure repose the ashes of the once beautiful Jeanette M. Hart, whose slab bears the symbol of her faith. She, the fairest of all the sisters, renounced the world and, embracing the Roman faith, became a nun. Her remains were brought home from Rome and laid to rest with the service of the Church of England. In a little separate enclosure, whispered to have been consecrated by the Rite of Rome, another sister is lying. When Commodore Hull cruised in the old frigate United States, one of these beautiful girls was on board his ship. She was seen by Bolivar, who fell desperately in love with her at a ball and became so attentive that the American officers believed they were betrothed. Saybrook was also the original site of Yale College, 15 commencements having occurred here. The building, which was of a single story, stood about midway between fort and palisade. Its removal in 1718 to New Haven occasioned great excitement, and the library had to be carried away under the protection of a guard. The Saybrook platform, so called, was adopted here after the commencement of 1708. Harvard and Yale were in infancy, probably not different from those Scotch universities, which Dr. Johnson said were like a besieged town, where every man had a mouthful, but no man a bellyful. The shores about Saybrook offer little that is noteworthy. On the beach, the tide softly laps the incline of sand that looks like a slab of red freestone, fine-grained and hard. A dry spot flashing beneath your tread, or perhaps a seabird circling above your head, attends your loiterings. Look now off upon the Sound, where the golden sunset is flowing over it, gilding the waves, the distant shores, and the sails of passing vessels with beams that in dying are transfused into celestial fires. Idle boats are rocked and caressed on this golden sea. Yonder distant gleam is a lighthouse, kindled with heavenly flame. The world is transfigured, that we may believe in paradise. Soon yellow flushes into pale crimson, blending with a sapphire sky. Standing on the strand, we are transformed and seem to quaff of the elixir of life. Now the violet twilight deepens into somber shadows. A spark appears in the farther sea. Soon others shine out like glowworms in your path, while twinkling stars, seen for a moment, disappear as if they, too, revolved for some more distant shore. The Sound becomes a vague and heaving blackness, and now, with gentle murmurings, the rising tide effaces our wayward footprints. Footnotes. The term Brother Jonathan originated with Washington, who applied it to Governor Jonathan Trumbull of Connecticut. When any important matter was in agitation, the general would say, "We must consult Brother Jonathan." General William Hart, an old soldier of the Revolution, was a wealthy and highly esteemed citizen of Saybrook. In 1795, with Oliver Phelps and others, he purchased the tract in Ohio called the Western Reserve. The Commodores Hull, uncle and nephew, married sisters belonging to this family. Commodore Andrew Hull Foote was also a nephew of Commodore Isaac Hull, whose widow was still living when I visited Saybrook in 1874. The eminence on which the fort stood, also called Tomb Hill, jutted into the river, being united to the shore by a beach and bordered by salt marshes. It was steep and unassailable from any near vantage ground. In 1647, the first fort was accidentally destroyed by fire. In the British State Paper Office is a translation of part of a letter, dated at Fort Amsterdam, in 1633, from Gualtier Twilly to the governor of Massachusetts Bay, concerning the right of the Dutch to the river. The governor says that he has taken possession of it in the name of the state's general, and set up a house on the north side, with intent to plant. He desires Winthrop will defer his claims until their superior magistrates are agreed. The word is placed after river in the calendars, but the date and other given facts are probably allusions to the Connecticut attempt. Lieutenant Gibbons, Sergeant Willard, and some carpenters. Lyon Gardner's account. See the correspondence in Hutchinson's History of Massachusetts, Appendix, Volume I, between John Cotton and Lord Say. There is nothing improbable in the story, either from the rank or political importance of the personages mentioned. The civil commotions in England rather give it a groundwork of probability. The authorities in support of the emigration are Dr. George Bates, the physician of Cromwell, in his Elenchus Malleum Nuperorum in Anglia, William Lilly's Life and Times. London, 1822, Sir William Dugdale's Troubles in England, Mather's Magnalia, Oldmixon's British Empire in America, Neal's History of New England, and Hutchinson's History of Massachusetts. Hume, Chalmers, Graham, Hallam, Russell, Macaulay, and others repeat the story with various modifications. Aiken, Forster, Bancroft, Young, and others deny or doubt it. The arguments pro and con may be consulted in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register for 1866. Letchford in his Plain Dealing says, There are 5 or 6 towns and churches upon the River Connecticut where are worthy Master Hooker, Master Warham, Master Hewitt, and divers others, and Master Fenwick with the Lady Boatler at the river's mouth in a fair house, and well fortified, and one Master Higgison, a young man, their chaplain. These plantations have a patent. The lady was lately admitted of Master Hooker's church, and thereupon her child was baptized. Fenwick played upon him a little with the great guns, which did gar him gang down more fool than he went up. Carlyle. Hutchinson places his death in 1657. There was a Lieutenant Colonel Fenwick killed in one of the battles between Condé and Turenne in Flanders in 1658. The action occurred before Dunkirk. Fenwick's last request of Lockhart, the English commander, was to be buried in Dunkirk. Thurlow, Volume I, p. 156. Lyon Gardner became the owner of the fertile island bearing his name at the east end of Long Island. It is 7 miles long and a mile broad, with excellent soil. Some time ago, its peculiar beauty and salubrity caused it to be called the Isle of Wight. The island, I believe, still remains in the possession of the Gardner family. For many years it descended regularly from father to son by entail. The Indian name was Munchingannock, or the place of Indian graves. One sister married Commodore Hull, as related, another married Hahn. Heman Allen, minister to Chile, and a third, Reverend Dr. Jarvis of St. Paul's, Boston. Index A. Acadia, New England, included in 18. Means taken to people, 25. Expatriation of the French, 303. Adams, John, resists the pretensions of the French Directory, 378, 392. Agamenticus, called Snadon Hill, 21. Landfall of early navigators, 120. Ascent of 123. Mountains seen from 125. Agassiz Louis at Mount Desert, 48. Anecdotes of and personal appearance, 49. Alden John claimed to have first landed on Plymouth Rock, 290. Tradition of his courtship, 300, 301. Alexander William Earl of Stirling, islands in his patent, 339. Alphonse Jean cited 18. His manuscripts and account of him, 22. Allerton Isaac at Marblehead, 236. Appledore Island, 160, 187. Argall Sir Samuel, his descent at Mount Desert Island, 24, 36. Arnold Governor Benedict, extract from his will, 371, note. Arnold General Benedict, 427. Anecdote of 427, 428. Attacks New London, 428, 429. Birthplace, 437. Aubert Thomas, supposed discovery by, 21, 275. Audubon John James, at Mount Desert, 48. Auvergne, Laterda in America, 396. Auvergne Regiment, 396. B. Badger's Island, 149. Bald Head Cliff, York, Maine, described 115, 116. Wreck at 117. Bar Harbor, visit to 43. Barton Colonel William, carries off General Prescott, 409, 410. Basques on the New England coast, 125. At Newfoundland, 126. Bay Francos, the true Frenchman's Bay, 50. Beauchamp John mentioned 60. Beaver Tail, Newport, 357, 381. Beaver, the former value of 41, 42. Beebe Reverend George at the Shoals, 167. Belfast, Maine, name of 63, note. Belknap Jeremy, his account of a sand avalanche, 319. Berkeley George Bishop, portrait of 368, at Newport, 384. Bernard General Simon, Napoleon's estimate of 378, 379. In the United States, 379. Builds Fortress Monroe and Fort Morgan, 379, note. Beard Pier arrives at Port Royal, 35, at Mount Desert, 35. Billington John, executed at Plymouth, 267. Bayern Duc de Lauzon, 394. Blau or Blie of Guillaume, Atlas cited, 21. Block Island, 421, see note. Blueberries, their value in New England, 39. Humors of the Pickers, 120. Bluefish, singular disappearance of, 344. Blythe, Captain Samuel, killed, 107. Body of Laws, extracts from, 268. Bontemps, order of 95-96. Boone Island, wreck of the Nottingham, 172, 173. Boatler Lady Anne, C. Fenwick. Bradford William, his manuscript History of Plymouth, 268. Monument at Plymouth, 277. 284, 285, 286, 290, note, 291. Receives Massasoit, 293-294. Account of Cape Cod, 307. Brevoort J. Carson, 359, note. Brigadier's Island, ownership and fishery at 64. Brock, Reverend John, anecdote of 163. Broadhead John Roman, mentioned, 22, note, 278. Bromfield Major, kills Colonel Ledyard, 428. Brother Jonathan, origin of the name, 442, note. Broughton Nicholas, 251. Brown Dexter, establishes first stagecoach between Boston and Providence, 411. Brown Robert, founder of Brownists, 280, note. Brown's Island, Plymouth, disappearance of 295. Bull Governor Henry, burial place of 405, note. Burroughs George at Wells, 111. Burroughs Lieutenant William, killed, 107. 100. Cabot Sebastian, voyage of 20. Camden Mountains, approach to 62, Indian name of 93. Canoniccut Island, visited 380, see note. Cape Ann, fishery at 157. Cape Arundel, spouting horn at 47. Cape Breton, early knowledge of 21. Cape Cod, a coup d'oil of 304-306, early accounts of 307, Poutring Court's fight at 308. Ship canal begun from Barnstable to Buzzards Bay, 311, note. Harbors frozen in 1875, 320. Changes in its exterior shores, 322, 323. Cape Cod Harbor, Provincetown. Cape Nettuck, 122. Capuchins at Penobscot, 81. Napoleon's opinion of 82. Cartier Jacques, sails for America, 20. Manner of taking possession of Canada, 23. Carver John, supposed burial place, 276. Carver Nathaniel, Lord Nelson's generous act to, 271. Caston the Younger, kidnapped, 81, returns to France, 81. Caston Jean Vincent, Baron de, sketch of 79-80, in the attack on Pemaquid, 98. Castine approach to 64-65, views from Fort George, 65, seized and fortified by the British, 67, besieged, 68-69, Indian name of 67, Fort Penobscot described, 74, singular discovery of coins at 74-75, its early history sketched, 76-82, old cemetery of 84. Cedar Island, 160. Chamley Emda, made prisoner at Penobscot, 78. Champernowne Arthur, 149. Champernowne Francis, 149. Champlain Samuel, quoted 18. Title of his map, 22, note. Names Mount Desert, 28. Voyage of 1604-92-93. Suggests Elorder de Bontemps, 95. Disgrays Isles of Shoals, 122. Description of Plymouth Bay, 274-275. At Cape Cod, 308. Account of Indian fishing, 314. Channing William Ellery, 400, note. Charlevoix's account of siege of Fort William Henry, 99. Chasseluck's Marquis, 394. Chilton Mary, tradition about 291. Chwaquit, see Saco River. Christmas, how observed in Plymouth, 292. Chub Pasco, surrenders the fort at Pemaquid, 99. Church Colonel Benjamin, at Castine, 75-302, 372. Church F.E., anecdote of 50. Clark D. Wasket, a native of Mount Desert, 49. Clark's Island, Plymouth, 269. Sail to 295. Watson House, 297. Election Rock, 297, 298. Landing of the Exploring Party, 298. Clinton Sir Henry, outgeneraled by Washington, 428. Cobb money, specimens found at Castine, 75 note. Codfish aristocracy, origin of the appellation, 314. Cod fishery in the 16th century, 156. In the 17th, 230–236, at Provincetown, 313, 314. Coddington, William, sketch of 360, at Anne Hutchinson's trial, 361, decay of his family, 362, burial place of 405. Coffin, Sir Isaac, founds a school at Nantucket, 341, 342. Coggeshall, John, at Anne Hutchinson's trial, 361, monument to 405. Colbert mentioned, 78–82. Collins, Captain Gamaliel, 316. Colonial Society described, 60. Connecticut River, settlements on, 444, 445, 446. Constitution, frigate, chased into Marblehead, 256. Corey Giles, pressed to death, 227. Corwin Jonathan, a witch judge, 223. Cousin Captain, story of his discovery of America, 22. Craddock, Governor Matthew, establishes fishing station at Marblehead, 236. Cranberry, the growth and culture of 39, 317. Cranberry Islands, 39. Cromwell Oliver, his proposed emigration to New England, 446. Cushman Charlotte, residence at Newport, 375. Cushman Robert, 277. Cushman Thomas, 277. Cutts Captain Joseph, 143. Cutts Sarah Chauncey, sad story of 142, 143. Cuttyhunk, first English colony at 327, see note. 500. Damariscotta, oyster shell heaps at, visited and described, 100, 101. Daniel Father, his history mentioned, 23. Dartmouth Indians sold as slaves, 302. D'Aulnay Charnisay, Charles de Menu, at Penobscot, 76. Imbroglio with Latour, 77. His death, 78. Dean John Ward, 173 note. Dean John, 173. Dean Silas, Mr. Adams's opinion of, 431. Decatur Stephen, blockaded at New London, 432. Duel with Baron, 433. See note. De Costa, B.F. mentioned, 22 note. De Monts, efforts of to obtain colonists, 25. Cedes his privileges in Acadia, 34, 35. His commission and privileges, 153–155. Descries the Isles of Shoals, 155. In Plymouth Bay, 273, 274, 275. Dermer Captain Thomas, at Nantucket, 324. Dupont's Count Christian, anecdote of 395, see note. D'Iberville makes a demonstration against Pemaquid, 97, captures Fort William Henry, 98, see note. Dighton Rock, inscription attributed to Northmen, 369, 416, 417, 418. Dorr Rebellion, 365 note. Doty or Doughton Edward, fights a duel, 266, 297 note. Douglas William, quoted 23–24. Down East, an undiscovered country, 85–86. Drake Sir Bernard, manner of his death, 24. Druillettes Pier Gabriel at Plymouth, 285. Duck Island, 160, 190. Dummer Shubil, Minister of York, 135. Dumplings, Fort On, 358, 380, 381. Dunbar, Colonel David, at Pemaquid, 100. Dutch Island, 380. Duthat Gilbert, killed at Mount Desert, 36. Duxbury, sail to from Plymouth, 299. Captain's Hill and Monument, 300. Historic personages of Duxbury, 300, et seq. Dwight Timothy, at Newport, 370. A. Ellery William, his death, 400. Endicott Governor John, his farm, 218, 255. Estang Count de at Newport, 387. Guillotined, 388. Excommunication in New England churches, 280, 281, note. F. Faunce Thomas identifies Plymouth Rock, 289, note. Fenwick, George, 445, 446, 447. Fenwick Lady, her remarkable monument, 446. Her story, 447. Fillmore John, exploit of 176. Fisher's Island, 420, 422, note. Flucker Lucy, marries General Knox, 61. Fly William, the pirate, 177, 178. Forefathers' Day, its true date and significance, 290. Fort Adams, 358. Fort Day, 377. History of the Fortress, 377, 378. Fort Constitution, Great Island, New Hampshire, 199, 200. Fort Fenwick, Saybrook, 444, 445. Fort Frederick, Pemaquid, described 96. Fort George, Casting, described 66. Siege of 67, 68, 69. Imprisonment and escape of General Wadsworth and Major Burton, 70, 71. Fort Griswold, 422. See note, assault on 428, 429. See note. Fort M. Clary, 144. Fortress Monroe, 379. Fort Morgan, Mobile, 379, note. Fort Penobscot, Casting, described 73, 74. Fort Point, site of 63, 66. Fort Sewell, Marblehead, 255. Fort Trumbull, 422. See note, 428. Fort William Henry, Pemaquid, description and importance of 97, captured by D'Iberville, 99. Fort Walcott, 358. See note. Fox George at Newport, 403, denounces the New England magistrates, 403. See note. Franklin, Sir Charles, romantic marriage of 256. Franklin Benjamin, 341. Fremont, General John C., mentioned 43. Friday not an unlucky day, 26. Funeral customs, ancient, 136. J. Gardiner's Island, 448, note. Gardiner Lion at Saybrook, 445, 448. See note. Garrison houses described, 139, 140. Gay Head Indian legend of, 349. George Roman III, cause of his insanity, 394. Jerish's Island, 149. Jerry Elbridge, 249, 250. Gerrymander, the origin of 250, note. Gibson, James, 146. Gilbert Raleigh, with Popham's Colony, 93. Gilbert Sir H., method of taking possession of Newfoundland, 23. Glover, General John, anecdote of 253. Tomb of 259. Goat Island, Newport, 358. Gorgina, see Old York. Gorges, Sir F., notice of Weymouth's voyage, 92. Plantation at Agamenticus, Old York, 131, et sec. Gorges, Ferdinando, son of Thomas, 131. Gorges, Robert, 133. Gorges, Thomas, mayor of Gorgina, 131. Gorges, Captain William, 131. Great Head Cliff, Mount Desert, 50. Great Island, see Newcastle. Gregoire, Madame, at Mount Desert, 56. Gridley, Richard, at Louisbourg, 147. Groton, the Battle Monument, 427. British attack on, 426. The Pequots destroyed, 429, 430. Girchville, Madame de, attempts to colonize Mount Desert, 34, 35, 36. A. Hakluyt Richard, quoted 19. Hale, Reverend John on Witchcraft, 214. Haley's Island, see Smutty Nose. Haley, Samuel, 175. His epitaph, 183. Hamilton, Lady Emma, 433. Hancock, Dorothy Quincy, 204, 205. Hardy, Sir Thomas Masterman, off New London, 432. Declines a duel of ships, 433. At Nelson's deathbed, 433. Harrison Peter, 360, see note. Hart General William, 433, see note. Hawkins Thomas, the Pirate, 176. Hawthorne Nathaniel, birthplace of 221. Hebrews at Newport, 366, 367. Hempstead Sir Robert, 425. Henrietta Dorleans poisoned, 56. Henry Roman IV, S. Projects in the New World, 20. Assassinated, 35. Herring Cove, 319, 320. Hessians at Newport, 380, 381. Higginson Francis, Account of Salem, etc., 241. Hilton Martha, Romantic Story of 205, 206. Hilton Richard, 205, see note. Hog Island, see Appledore. Holmes is Whole, 327, note. Hauntfit John, Heroism of His Wife, 185. Hopkins, Dr. Samuel, 406. Howe Richard, Earl, Naval Action with Desting, 388. Howland's Ferry, 413, note. Hull, Commodore Isaac, 443, 444. Hull, General William, mentioned, 56. Humphreys, Joshua, Report on Establishing a Dockyard at Newport, 378. Huntington, General Eben, 438, 439. Huntington, General Jedediah, 438. Huntington, Governor Samuel, 439. Hutchinson, Anne, Her Trial and Banishment, 361, 362. 1. Ireson, Benjamin, called Flood, of Marblehead, story of 253, 254. Isle Haut, names 29. Isle Nauset, total disappearance of 322. Isle of Rhodes, see Rhode Island. Isles of Shoals, de Mont sees them, 155, described by Smith and Levitt, 155, 156, advantages for fishery, 157. Sail from Portsmouth, 158. Isles described, 160, see note. Their name, 161. General aspect of, 162. Star Island Rambles, 162, et sec. Semi-barbarous condition of ancient Gosport, 164, 165. Burial grounds, 166, 167. Caverns and cliffs, 168, 169, 170. Miss Underhill's chair, 170, 171. Mountains seen off the coast, 172, note. Dunfish, 174. Smutty Nose, 175. Piracy in Colonial Time, 176-179. Blackbeard, 178. Thomas Morton, Gent. 180, 181. Samuel Haley, 183. The Spanish Wreck, 184. Wagner the Murderer, 185, 186. Appledore, 186, 190. Duck Island, 190. Londoners, 191. White Island Light, 192. J. Jackson Andrew, 151. Jeffrey's Ledge, 161. Jesuits' Persecutions by, 82. Intrigues of 82-83. Jones Margaret, executed as a witch, 210. Jourdan Jean-Baptiste, Marshal of France at Newport, 388. Judson Adoniram, 277. K. Cadesquit, probably Kendiskeg, 35. Calb Baron de, in New England on a secret mission, 387. Kennebec River, discovery and name, 92. King Charles Bird, 368. Kittery Point, named, 141, note. The Cuts House, 142, Fort M. Clary, 144, the Pepperells, 144, et sec. Pepperell Tomb, 147, Jerish's Island, 149, Other Islands, 149, John Langdon, 150, 151. Knox General Henry, connection with Waldo Patent, 61, involves General Lincoln, 62. 50. Lafayette, 390, at Newport, 391. Leighton Thomas B., 192. Langdon John, anecdotes of 150, 151, 200, note. La Perouse in America, 71. La Touraglate sells the Seigneury of Acadia, 78. La Tour Chevalier mentioned, 76. Troubles with D'Aulnay, 77, 78. Lawrence Captain James, death of 257. Lee General Charles at Newport, 356, note 404. Lee Colonel Jeremiah, sketch of 245. Lee John, 247. Lee William Raymond, 247. Leffingwell Thomas relieves Uncas, 436. Leonard Forge, Taunton, 419. Lescarbot Mark, his criticism of Alphonse, 18, quoted 58. Levitt Christopher, mentioned 96, describes Agamenticus, 131. At Isles of Shoals, 155, 156, 161. Notice of Plymouth, 273. Leverett John, a Muscongas patentee, 60. At Penobscot, 78. Lincoln General Benjamin, sketch of 61. Livermore Samuel, attempts to shoot Captain Broke, 257. Lobsters, process of canning for market, 84. Facts about 85. Longfellow Hun, Stephen, 71. Long Island Sound, 421. Londoners Island, 160, 191. Louis Roman 14. Mary's Domain Tenon, 82. Opinion of La Salle's Discoveries, 83. Lovell Solomon, Commands in Penobscot Expedition, 68. Retreats, 69. 1000. Mackerel, Habits of 91. Macy Thomas, Settles at Nantucket, 339. Magnalia, Mathers, Southey's Opinion of 93. Maine, Sea Coast of 17, 18. Embraces Norumbega, Mavoshan, 18. Other names applied to her territory, 18. French occupation of 18. Her enterprise and products, 60. Part of Massachusetts, 68. Maine Tenon, Madame de. Intrigue with the Jesuits, 82, 83. Malaga Island, 160. Malbone, Colonel Godfrey, 408, 409. Malbone, Edward G., 409. Mananas Island, 104. Manly, John, 251, 252. Mansell, Sir Robert, mentioned, 34. Marblehead, its conformation and topography, 228, 229, 230, 231. Lafayette there, 229. Islands off the port, 231. The Neck, 231. Annals and Decay of the Cod Fishery, 232, 233, 234, 235. Early Settlement, 236, 241, 242. Described, 238, 239, 240, 241. Character of Early Fishermen, 243. Golet's Account, 243. Lee Mansion, 245, 246. St. Michael's, 248, The Old Sea Lions, 251, 252, The Dialect, 254, Fort Sewell, 255. Chesapeake and Shannon, 256, 257, Old Burial Ground, 258, Perils of the Fishery, 259, 260. Marriage First in New England, 285. Mashope, Legend of, 349. Mason, Captain John, 201. Mason John attacks the Pequot stronghold, 429, note 430. Massachusetts Bay, alleged discovery of 1822. Massachusetts Historical Society, motive of its founding, 147. Massasoit, entry into Plymouth, 293, 294. Mass, Ennemond, at Mount Desert, 35. Mavoshan, Maine, so styled, 18. Mayhew, Thomas, purchases Nantucket, 339. Owns Martha's Vineyard and Elizabeth Islands, 340. Maypole, ancient custom of, 182. M. Clary Andrew, 144. Emmeline, Colonel Francis, seizes and fortifies Castine, 67. Mercator, Atlas of Sighted, 21. Myantonimo makes war on Uncas, 435. Is killed, 436. Myantonimo Hill, 407, 408. Mohegan Indians, 436, 437. Monhegan Island, probably seen and named in 1604, 92, 102. Early knowledge of 102, described 104. Inscription at 106. Naval battle near 106, 107, 324. Moody, Joseph, handkerchief, 135. Moody, Reverend Samuel, anecdote of 135. Epitaph, 136. Moore, Sir John at Castine, 67. Napoleon's opinion of 68. Morse, Reverend Jedediah at the Shoals, 164. Describes currying fish, 174. Morse, SFB, paints landing of pilgrims, 264. Morton Thomas, his banishment, 180, 181. Mount Desert Island, discovered and named, 28. Champlain's description of 29 mountain ranges, 2932. Approach from Ellsworth, 31. First settlers, 33. Road to Southwest Harbor, 33-34. French colony on, 34-35-36. Shell heaps at, 37. Neighborhood of Southwest Harbor, 38. 39 islands off Sums Sound, 39. Christmas on, 40 at sec. Route to Bar Harbor, 41-42. Island nomenclature, 42. Islands off Bar Harbor, 43. Shore rambles to Schooner Head and Great Head, 43-48. Naturalists and artists who have visited, 4850. Excursion to Otter Creek and Northeast Harbor, 53-54. The Ovens, etc., 55-56. Mount Desert Rock, 53. Mount Hope, 414, 415, 416. Mugford, Captain James, 252, 253, 259. Muscongas Patent, History of 60-61. N. Nantucket, its early discovery, 324. Name, 325, 341. Voyage to 326, 327. The town described, 328, 329, 330. Whales, ships, and whaling, 331-334. Nantucket in the Revolution, 335. Cruising for whales, 335. The camels, 336. Whaling Annals, 336, 337. White settlement of the island, 339, 340, 341. Coffin School and Admiral Sir Isaac Coffin, 342. Blackfishing, 343, 344. Blue fishing at the opening, 344, 345, 346 Kodu, 347. Indian legends, 349. Indian absolutism, 350. Wasting of the shores, 350. Sias Conset, 351, 352. The Great South Shoal, 353. Sankati Head, 354. Surfside, 354. Narragansett Bay, Verrazani's supposed sojourn in, 359. Nautican or Nautican, see Nantucket. Nelson, Horatio, Lord Chivalric Conduct of 395. See note, death scene of 433. Nelson, John, Important Services of 98. Newcastle, 196 et sec. The Pool, 197. Old Charter and Records, 198, 199. Little Harbor, 200. New England of Ancient Writers, 1727. Early names of 1819. First called New England, 20. Attempts to colonize, 24. Quality of immigration to 25. Patents of 133. Supposed visit of Northmen, 369. Note. Newfoundland, English occupation of 23. Seizures of Portuguese at 24. Basques at 126. Fisheries of 156. New France, New England included in 2021. New London, sail up the Thames, 422. The town and its beginnings, 422-423. Lighthouses and lightships, 423-424. Hempstead House, 425. Courthouse, 424. Old Burial Ground, 426. The Harbor, 426. Arnold's Descent, 428-429. Newport Artillery, 363, 364. Newport, the Old Town, 356 et sec. Its climate, 357. Approach from sea, 357, 358. Its commerce, 359. Street rambles, 359, 372. City Hall, 360. Coddington's Cove, 362. The Wantons, 362, 363. State House, 363, 364. Jews Cemetery, 365, 366, 367. Redwood Library 367, 368. Old Stone Mill 369, 370, 371, 372. Cliff Walk 373, et sec. 40 Steps 374. Cottage Life at the Seaside 375. Lily Pond, Spouting Rock and Brenton's Reef 376. Fort Adams and Fort Day 377, 378, 379. Napoleon's Engineer 378, 379. Dumplings 380. Hessians 381. The Drives 381, 382. The Beaches and Purgatory 382, 383. Hanging Rock and Whitehall 384. The French Occupation 386, et sec. French Diplomacy 387. Attack of D'Estaing 387, 388. Celebrities of the French Army and Navy 388, 397. Rhode Island Cemetery 398, et sec. Quaker Annals 401, et sec. Other burial places 405, 406. Noailles Viscounte 391, 392. Norumbega, see Norumbega. North Lord, how he received the news of Cornwallis's surrender 393. Northmen, supposed voyage to New England 369. Note. Norton Francis, settles at Agamenticus 131. Norumbega, river and country of 1819-21. Explored by Champlain 28. Norwich approach to 434. The Mohegans 435, 436, 437. The town 439, 440, 441. Nubble the Not Savage Rock 120. Nurse Rebecca, executed for witchcraft 213, 224, 226. Oak Bluffs Cottage City at 375. Odierns Point, first settlement of New Hampshire at 200. Ogunquit described 114, 115. Old Colony, seal of 267. Old Am John, his ingenious punishment at Plymouth 286, 287. Killed 421. Old South Church, Boston, New England, Library Inn plundered 268. Old Stone Mill, Newport 369, 370, 371, 372. Orleans, ancient wreck discovered at 322. Ortelius, map of 1920. Otis James at Plymouth, 288. Paddock Ichabod, teaches Nantucket men how to take whales, 315. Paris Samuel, witch-finders at his house, 213. His minutes of examination, 224. Peabody George, 218. Pease Samuel, fight with pirates, 176. Pemaquid Point, visit to 87, et sec. British descent at repulsed 89. Porgy Fishery at 89-90. Early History 92-101. Weymouth at 92. Fort Frederick at 96-97. Other fortifications 97. Fort William Henry at captured 99. Ancient settlement at 100. Indians kidnapped by Weymouth 105. Pematic, see Mount Desert. Pentagayet, meaning of the name 19. Note, on Blau's map 21, how settled 25. See Castine. Penobscot Bay and River, Champlain's account of 1819, called Pemategat 19. Meaning of name 19. Note, called Pembroke's Bay 21. Smith's account of 24. Approach to in a fog 58, 59, described 63, 64. Penobscot Expedition, history of 68, 69. Pepperell Andrew, his affair with Hannah Waldo, 61. Pepperell Sir William, 61. Sketch and residence of 144-147. Portrait of 145-146. His tomb, 147. Pepperell William Sen, 188. Perry Oliver Hazard, 363. Monument to 401-404. Peters Hugh, 445. Philip King, 349. Seat at Mount Hope, 414. His capture, 416. Phipps Sir William, builds Fort William Henry, 97. His connection with witchcraft, 210. Accusation of his wife, 214. Pigot Sir Robert defends Newport, 387. Pilgrims, the not strictly Puritans, 280. Their church, 280, 281, 282. Land at Cape Cod, 307. Pillory, one described, 365. Piscataqua, capture proposed, 80. Sail down, 159. Earl Bellamont's opinion of, 197. Plymouth Bay, 268, 274, 275. Plymouth Beach, 269. Plymouth on Smith's map, 21. Establishes a trading house at Castine, 76. Dispossessed, 76-77. The colony patents, 133. Plymouth described, 262. Pilgrim memorials, 263-67. Pictures of the landing, 264. First duel at Plymouth, 266. The colony seal, 267. The compact, 267. First execution, 267. Pilgrim Laws and Chronicles, 268. Burial Hill, 268, 276, 277, 278, 279. The Harbor, 268, 269. Names of the settlement, 270. Why it was chosen, 271. Desolated by a plague, 272, 273. French make the first landing, 274, 275. Other settlements called Plymouth, 276. Pilgrim's First Church, 278. Church Customs, 279, 280. Leyden Street, 283, et seq. The town in 1627, 284. Governor Bradford's, 286. Alline House, 287. Coles Hill, 288. Plymouth Rock, 289. The Landing, 290, 291. Samoset, 292. Entry of Massasoit, 293, 294. Clark's Island, 295, et seq. See article, Clark's Island, Plymouth Beach, 296. Plymouth, England, 270. Plum Island, 421. Point Judith, 357. See note. Point of Graves, 196, 202. Poor Ben Purley, mentioned 22 note. Popham, Chief Justice, efforts to colonize New England, 93-94. Popham George, leader of the colony at the Kennebec, 93. Death, 93. Popular superstitions, some enumerated, 114. Porcupine Islands, 43. Port Royal settled, 95. Port St. Louis, see Plymouth, 275. Pound Thomas, a pirate, 176. Poutrincourt Biencourt arrives at Port Royal, 35. Poutrincourt Ginde receives Port Royal from de Monts, 34. His fight with natives at Cape Cod, 308. Pownall Thomas builds a fort on the Penobscot, 66. Prior Matthew allowed roast beef in Lent, 314. Provincetown described 309-312. Town Hill, 311. Cape Names, 312. Portuguese colony at 312-313. Fishery of 313 et seq. Whaling from 315. The Desert, 316. Cranberry culture, 317. Walk to Race Point, 316, et seq. The Sand Avalanche, 319. Huts of Refuge, Herring Cove, 319. The Terrible Winter of 1874-75, 320. Disasters on the ocean side, 321, 322. Prudence Island, 380. Purchase, Samuel, quoted 24. Purgatory Bluff, 383. Puritans distinguished from separatists, 280. Putnam, General Israel, birthplace of 217. Laconic letter to Governor Tryon, 218. Q. Quakers as sailors, 339. See note 401, et seq. Persecution in New England, 402-403. Burial customs, 404. Quincy Dorothy Madam Hancock, 205. Quincy Josiah, 406. Quincy Judith, 357. R. Race Point, 311, 319. Ramusio Gambetta, map cited, 21. Rassiers, Isaac de at Plymouth, 278, 283. Raisley, Isaac de, commands in Acadia, 77. Redwood Abraham, 367-368. See note. Redwood Library, Newport, 368. See note. Revere Paul in Penobscot Expedition, 68. Rhode Island, Island of 407, et sec. Tonomy Hill, 407, The Glen, 408, Prescott's Capture, 409, 410, Talbot's Feet, 410, 411, Early Stages, 411, Lawton's Valley, 412, Early Settlement of 413, 414, Revolutionary Earthworks and History, 413, 414. Richmond's Island, 369. Note. Rochambeau Count proposes the capture of Penobscot, 71. At Newport, 388, 389, 390, 391. Rockland Brief Sketch of 5960. S. Saco Beach, Superstition relative to 114. Saco River on Blau's map, 21. Richard Vines at 133. De Monts there, 154. Salem in 1692, 220, 222. Old Witch House, 223. Witch Hill, 225. Hanging the Condemned Witches at 226. Formation of Church at 281. Salem Village, Witchcraft at 208 et sec. The Witch Ground, 213. Names of the Witchfinders, 213. Note. Their motives and power, 214. Humors of witchcraft, 215, 216. Salmon, disappearance of 64. Saltonstall captain, commands in Penobscot Expedition, 68. Disagreement with General Lovell, 69. Samoset, Sagamore of Pemaquid, 96, 264. At Plymouth, 292, 293. Sandine Arthur, 256. Sankaty Head, 354. Sergeant Henry paints Landing of Pilgrims, 264. Sassafras, Its Medicinal Virtues, 126. Savage Rock, probably at Cape Ann, 120, 121. Say Lord proposes to emigrate to New England, 446. Saybrook, 441, et sec. Hart Mansion, 443. Old Fortress at the Point, 444. Settled, 445. Cromwell's proposed emigration to 446. Old Burial Place, 446, 447, 448. Scallop Shell, Its Historical Significance, 348. Schooner Head, A Visit to 46. Seabury, Samuel, Bishop, 425, 426. See note. Sedgwick Robert at Pentagat in Jamaica, 78. Selman John, 251. Sewall Samuel recants his belief in witchcraft, 225. Sewall David, 136. Sheaf Jacob, 151. Sherburne, see Nantucket. Shipwrecks, the Isidore, 117, et sec. On Smutty Nose, 184, the Nottingham, 172, 173. At Cape Cod, 272, the General Arnold, 296, the James Rommel, 320, 321, the Giovanni, 321, 322. Essex of Nantucket, 337. Sias Consett, Nantucket Island, visited 350, 351, 352. Siddons, Sarah, anecdote of 376. Smibert John at Newport, 384, 385. See note. Smith Captain David, 316. Note. Smith John names New England, 20. His map, 21, mentions Monhegan, 104. Monument, Star Island, 167. Appledore, 189. Account of Cape Cod, 307. Smutty Nose Island, 160, 175, 182. Some Sound, 31 at Passim. Sumsville, Mount Desert, 30. First settlers of 33. Southack Cyprian, his chart, 308. Southworth Alice Carpenter, 284, 285. Sparhawk Harriet Hurst, 147. Sparhawk William Pepperell, 147. Standish Miles, his sword, 266. Residence, 300. Sketch of 301. Star Island, 160, 162, et sec. Stevens, Reverend Josiah, epitaph of 166. Steuben, Baron, arrival at Portsmouth, 207. Stevens, General Isaac Ingalls, 401. Styles, Dr. Ezra, at Newport, 304, 368. Story, Elisha, 248. Story, Joseph, birthplace of 248. Stoughton, William, 225. Strafford, Earl of 204. Stuart Gilbert, anecdote of 406. Sullivan, John, 200 note, fights a battle on Rhode Island, 419. See note. Surreage, Agnes, marries a baronet, 256. T. Talbot, Silas, brilliant achievement of 410, 411. Tarentines, their country, 1924. Taunton River, 414, 415, 416, 417. Temple, Sir Thomas, renders Fort Pentagouet, 74, 78. Ternay, M. de Admiral, dies at Newport, 391. Thatcher, James, 264 note. Thaxter, Celia Layton, 192. Thevet, Andre, cited 19 note. Thomaston, Maine, named 60 note. Thompson, David, at Little Harbor, 201. Totten, General Joseph Gilbert, builds Fort Adams, 378. Relations with General Simon Bernard, 379. Turo, Abraham, 366, note, 367. Turo, Judah, 367, note. Trevitt, Samuel, 253. Truro, Provincetown part of, 309. Tuck, Reverend John, 163, 166, 167. Tucker, Samuel, 252. Tuckanuck Island, 344, see note. U. Uncas fights and conquers Myantanimo, 435. Slays him, 436. Burial place, 436. Friendship for the English, 437. See note. Underhill, Nancy J., death at Star Island, 170, 171. 5. Vane, Henry, procures a pass for New England, 94, 413. Vaughan, Colonel William, 146. Verrazani, Juan, his voyage, 20. Gives New England a Christian name, 20. Vines, Richard, in New England, 133, 272. Vinton, Reverend Francis, burial place of 401. W. Wadsworth Peleg in Penobscot expedition, 68. Kidnapped, 69. Escapes from Fort George, 70, 71. Wagner, Louis, 138, 185, 186. Waldo Hannah marries Thomas Flucker, 61. Waldo Patent, see Muscongas Patent. Waldo Samuel, sketch of 61. Wanton Joseph, his personal appearance, 363, see note. Portrait of 368. Arrested, 405. Warren, James, originates a revolutionary junto, 288. Warren, Mercy, her history of the Revolution, 288. Washing Day in New England, inaugurated, 307. Washington, George, at Kittery, 151. At Marblehead, 247. Disapproves the occupation of Newport by Rochambeau, 389. At Newport, 391. Watch Hill, Rhode Island, 420. See note. Webster, Daniel, residence and burial place, 302. Wells, Maine, walks in, 110. Beach Rambles, 111, 112, 113. Wentworth, Bennying, his mansion, Little Harbor, 203, et seq. Wentworth, Francis Deering, 206, 207. Wentworth, Hun, John, 202. Wentworth, John, 202. Wentworth, Sir John, sketch of 206, 207. Wentworth, Colonel Michael, 206, note. Wentworth, Samuel, 202. Wentworth, Reginald, 201. Weymouth, Captain George, see note, 76. Accounts of his voyage, 92. At Monhegan Island, 104, 105. Whale fishery in New England originates at Cape Cod, 315. Of Nantucket, 331, et seq. Wheelwright John, sketch of him, 110. White Island, 160, 192. Whitefield, George, 147. Williams, Roger, residence of 222. On Quakers, 404, 413. Winslow, General John, 303. Winthrop, John, Jun, 422, 423. Note. Witchcraft, see Salem Village. Wood End, 311. Willis, Samuel, Buys Plum Island, 421. Why? Yale College, founded at Saybrook, 448, 449. Yankee, disappearance of the, 442. York called Boston, 21. Cape Neddick, 122. York Beach, 127. York Harbor, 130. Historical resume, 131. Indifferent reputation of, 132. Meeting House, First Parish, 134. Old Jail, 136. Woodbridge's Tavern, 138. Cider Hill, 138. Garrison House, 139, 140. Sewall's Bridge, 141. The End. Valuable and interesting works. Published by Harper & Brothers, New York. Harper & Brothers will send the following works by mail, postage prepaid, to any part of the United States, on receipt of the price. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. By Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Illustrated by Gustave Doré, a magnificently illustrated and sumptuous volume. Folio, cloth, gilt edges, and in a neat box, $10. The Boys of 76. A History of the Battles of the Revolution, by Charles Carleton Coffin, copiously illustrated, 8 vo, cloth, $3. The Life and Habits of Wild Animals. Illustrated from designs by Joseph Wolfe. Engraved by J.W. and Edward Whymper, with descriptive letterpress by Daniel Gerard Elliott, FLS, FCS. 4 cloth, gilt edges, $4. The Life and Letters of Lord Macaulay. By his nephew G. Otto Trevelyan, MP, with portrait on steel, complete in 2 vols. 8 vo, cloth, uncut edges and gilt tops, $5, sheep, $6, half calf, $9.50, tree calf, $15. Selections from the writings of Lord Macaulay. Edited with occasional notes by George Otto Trevelyan, M.P. 8 vo, cloth, gilt tops and uncut edges, $2.50. Uniform in size and style with the library edition of Macaulay's Life and Letters. The Catskill Fairies. By Virginia W. Johnson. Illustrated by Alfred Fredericks, square 8 vo, illuminated cloth, gilt edges, $3. Caricature and Other Comic Art. In All Times and Many Lands, by James Parton, with 203 illustrations. 8 vo, cloth, gilt tops and uncut edges, $5. The Book of Gold and Other Poems. By J.T. Trowbridge. Illustrated, 8 vo, ornamental cover, gilt edges, $2.50. In a box. Art Education Applied to Industry. By Carl George Ward Nichols. Illustrated, 8 vo, cloth, illuminated and gilt, $4. Art Decoration Applied to Furniture. By Harriet Prescott Spofford. Illustrated, 8 vo, cloth, illuminated and gilt, $4. The Earth. A Descriptive History of the Phenomena of the Life of the Globe. By Elisée Reclus. Translated by the late B.B. Woodward, M.A., and edited by Henry Woodward, British Museum. Illustrated with 234 maps inserted in the text and 23-page maps printed in colors. 8 vo, cloth, $5, half calf, $7.25. The Ocean. Atmosphere and Life. Being the second series of A Descriptive History of the Life of the Globe, by Elisée Reclus. Illustrated with 250 maps or figures and 27 maps printed in colors. 8 vo, cloth, $6, half calf, $8.25. The Atmosphere. Translated from the French of Camille Flammarion. Edited by James Glacier, FRS, with 10 chromolithographs and 86 woodcuts. 8 vo, cloth, $6, half calf, $8.25. Goldsmith's Poetical Works. Poetical Works of Oliver Goldsmith, with illustrations by C.W. Cope, A.R.A., Thomas Cressick, J.C. Horsley, R. Headgrave, A.R.A., and Frederick Taylor, members of the Etching Club, with a biographical memoir and notes on the poems. Edited by Bolton Corney. 8 veau, cloth, beveled boards, $3, cloth, gilt edges, $3.75, Turkey Morocco, gilt edges, $7.50. California. For Health, Pleasure, and Residence. A Book for Travelers and Settlers, by Charles Nordhoff, profusely illustrated, 8 veau, cloth, $2.50. Northern California, Oregon, and the Sandwich Islands. By Charles Nordhoff, profusely illustrated, 8 veau, cloth, $2.50. A Dictionary of Religious Knowledge. For popular and professional use, comprising full information on biblical, theological, and ecclesiastical subjects, with nearly 1,000 maps and illustrations. Edited by the Reverend Lyman Abbott, with the cooperation of the Reverend T.J. Canant, D.D. Royal 8 veau, containing over 1,000 pages, cloth, $6, sheep, $7, half Morocco, $8.50. The Rise of the Dutch Republic. A History, by John Lothrop Motley, LLD, DCL with portrait of William of Orange. 3 vols, 8 veau, cloth, $10.50, sheep, $12, half calf, $17.25. History of the United Netherlands. From the death of William the Silent to the 12 Years' Truce 1609, with a full view of the English-Dutch struggle against Spain and of the origin and destruction of the Spanish Armada. By John Lothrop Motley, LLD, DCL with portraits. 4 vols, 8 veau, cloth, $14, sheep, $16, half calf, $23. Life and Death of John of Barneveld. Advocate of Holland, with a view of the primary causes and movements of the 30 Years' War. By John Lothrop Motley, LLD, DCL illustrated. 2 vols, 8 veau, cloth, $7, sheep, $8, half calf, $11.50. Pottery and porcelain of all times and nations. With tables of factory and artists' marks for the use of collectors. Profusely illustrated. By William C. Prime, LLDVO, cloth, gilt tops and uncut edges, $7. In a box. The Poets of the 19th Century. Selected and edited by the Reverend Robert Aris Wilmot, with English and American editions by Avart A. Dykink. 141 illustrations. Elegant small 4-2, cloth, gilt edges, $5 half calf, $5.50, full Morocco, gilt edges, $9. Songs of Our Youth. By the author of John Halifax, Gentleman. Set to music, square 4-2, cloth, illuminated, $2.50. Nooks and Corners of the New England Coast. By Samuel Adams Drake, with numerous illustrations. 8 veau, cloth, $3.50, half calf or half Morocco, $5.75. Peru. Incidents of Travel and Exploration in the Land of the Incas. By E. George Squeer, M.A., F.S.A., late U.S. Commissioner to Peru, with illustrations. 8 veau, cloth, $5. Contemporary Art in Europe. By S. G. W. Benjamin, copiously illustrated. 8 veau, cloth, illuminated and gilt, $3.50. The Poets and Poetry of Scotland. From the earliest to the present time. Comprising characteristic selections from the works of the more noteworthy Scottish poets with biographical and critical notices. By James Grant Wilson, with portraits on steel. 2 vols, 8 veau, cloth, $10. Pictorial Field Book of the Revolution. Or Illustrations by Pen and Pencil of the History, Biography, Scenery, Relics, and Traditions of the War for Independence. By Benson J. Lossing. 2 vols, 8 veau, cloth, $14, sheep, $15, half calf, $18. The Pictorial Field Book of the War of 1812. Or Illustrations by Pen and Pencil of the History, Biography, Scenery, Relics, and Traditions of the Last War for American Independence. By Benson J. Lossing. With 882 illustrations engraved on wood by Lossing and Barrett, chiefly from original sketches by the author. Complete in 1 volume, 1084 pages, large 8 veau. Price in cloth, $7, sheep, $8.50, full roan, $9, half calf or half Morocco extra, $10. The Geographical Distribution of Animals. With a study of the relations of living and extinct faunas as elucidating the past changes of the Earth's surface. By Alfred Russel Wallace, author of the Malay Archipelago, and C in 2 volumes, with maps and illustrations. 8 veau, cloth, $10. The First Century of the Republic. A review of American progress. 8 veau, cloth, $5, sheep, $5.50, half Morocco, $7.25. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook of Nooks and Corners of the New England Coast by Samuel Adams Drake.